Welcome to Quality Time with MoreSteam. I am your host, Dan Swartout. Today's guest is April Thomas. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, that name will sound familiar. April joined us about 6 months ago in episode 40. And unfortunately, because of some technical issues, we weren't able to use all of April's interview on the podcast. So April has joined the show again, where we can really dive deep into her areas of expertise. It's a great conversation. April is a Lean Six Sigma black belt who started her career as a social worker in hospice care. She brings that background into everything she does: continuous improvement, change management, and leadership development. Now, a lot has happened for April in the last 6 months. She's been presenting at major conferences, speaking to rooms full of CI practitioners and HR professionals, and doing important advocacy work outside of the professional world as well. We get into all of that on today's episode. We talk about psychological safety, what it actually looks like inside an organization, what happens when it isn't there, and why the absence of it shows up in your data, whether you realize it or not. We also talk about retention, layoffs, and what leaders need to understand about grief and loss when their organizations go through difficult change. Even if you're more into data, even if you're more into the technical side of Lean Six Sigma and operational excellence, after listening to this episode, you will understand why you cannot ignore culture. A thriving lean culture drives accurate data. And now, my conversation with April Thomas. Today, we are lucky enough to have April Thomas back on the podcast. April was on the show about 6 months ago. April, welcome back. We're so glad to have you here.
I'm really excited to be back and chat with you again, Dan.
So much. Of course, I follow you on LinkedIn. You've been up to so much over the last 6 months or so. Can you give us just a brief update of what you've been up to? I know you've done a lot of speaking engagements, a lot of presentations. So I'm excited to hear all about it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun for me. And if you had ever asked me, when I started my career as a social worker, if this is the direction I ever saw my career going, it's beyond my wildest dreams. So it's been really fantastic in that way. I've had the opportunity to speak at different conferences about grief and loss and change management and what does grief-informed leadership look like. I've been able to do speaking in terms of thinking about how do we incorporate meaningful experiences and design, and how can we repurpose process mapping to look at creating experiences and touch points, not only like in healthcare, but also just from a customer experience and perspective too. And then being able to do a lot of speaking around the topic I'm passionate about, which is preventing drunk and impaired driving. So it's been different topics, but all really purposeful and meaningful.
Well, I want to talk about all of those things with you. We've got to talk a little bit about them before when you joined us on the podcast the first time. And of course, the link to that episode will be in our show notes. The first thing I'd like to talk about is you were recently at the ASQ Lean and Six Sigma conference, where you led a presentation on psychological safety. And just tell us a little bit about how that came to be, how you got to present at that conference, what your facilitation was like. I read about it on LinkedIn, but unfortunately I could not be there, but I know it was very well received.
Yeah. So I did what was called a brain date, and it's informal networking conversations. And I submitted to do 3 of those. So they're, like I said, informal networking conversations. And so one of them, I selected the topic of talking about psychological safety as it relates to continuous improvement. And this is one of those that, registration was initially open to 8 people, and then 8 people had registered, and then they bumped it up to 12 or 15. And I ended up, I think, with about 20 people or so who attended that particular session. And it was really fabulous because as we started talking about just this open conversation of what is psychological safety, what does that look like in continuous improvement? What does that feel like? What is the impact if psychological safety isn't present? And at the end, like the consensus was continuous improvement doesn't exist in the absence of psychological safety, period.
April, when you're at the ASQ Lean and Six Sigma conference and you walk into a room full of people who are really data driven and tool focused, and you start talking about psychological safety, what's that room like? What's the initial reaction? How do they initially approach you?
So, right. And I own it and say, right, like I'm a social worker who fell in love with continuous improvement. So I approach this from a very different perspective. I come from a behavioral social science thinking. I'm a systems thinker. But I fell in love with lean and continuous improvement when I worked at Theta Care Health System back in 2007. And what I loved about it was I saw this opportunity to really fully harness my team members' talent and skills. And so I preface it when I speak, like that's the lens that I come from. But I also know, like from the data side of things, right? Business problems, when they're talking, companies are talking about, right? Like we're not getting out the productivity, we're having high turnover. A lot of those things, like if we look at root cause, it comes back to what is the foundation? What is your culture? Because I think about it from the sense of, right, if you're a gardener and your goal is to grow prize-winning tomatoes, you don't go searching out and saying, well, I'm going to find prize-winning tomato seeds and then hope and pray that they grow the biggest tomatoes that I can take for, presenting for a blue ribbon, right?
Right.
You start by looking at, okay, I want prize-winning tomatoes, but I have to make sure that I really tend to and nurture the soil that those are supposed to grow in, because if I don't, no matter what kind of seed I have, I'm not going to get the outcome. And to me, it's kind of that perspective of respect for people. To me, that lean is really built on. That's your foundation. That's your soil. Psychological safety is the enabler. That's how well do people feel and experience the ability to bring up things like, things that aren't working, talk about mistakes or challenges. That's what creates the culture of continuous improvement. That's the outcome.
Yeah, let's get into the mechanics of this a little bit, April. How does a lack of psychological safety actually corrupt process data? What does that look like when it's actually happening inside an organization?
Yeah, so things that you might see is data that looks too good to be true, data that looks too clean, things that you say, if people know what the data is supposed to look like, they might alter the process or adjust it to get the data and outcomes that they know senior leaders or management are looking for.
They're cooking the book, essentially, kind of cooking the books.
Yeah, right. So they're altering processes to get the outcome that they know leadership wants instead of reflecting on this is really truly what the data is saying. Now let's talk about the data and what do we need to change or adjust because we have a systemic problem and the symptom is showing up in the data.
When you're having this discussion in the room full of Lean Six Sigma practitioners, what are they saying about their own organizations? Are they recognizing what you're talking about?
A lot of them do, right? And there's this challenge of where the organization wants to go. Right. They want to be achieving, high productivity. They want creativity. They want innovation. They want to be right. They want that competitive advantage. But then when we look at the systems and the organizational culture to say, is that in place? Is this a high respect culture? Is this a low respect culture? And how are you growing and skilling your team? How are you leveraging talent? How are you being thoughtful, intentional, and strategic about where you want to go? And I think there's a lot of individuals that then they start to see how those systems aren't necessarily all aligned and functioning. And the outcome is they're not getting the creativity. They're not getting the innovation. They're not getting, the productivity numbers. They're not getting product quality or quantity. They have high turnover, high scrap, a lot of rework, a lot of dissatisfaction in the organization.
Because Lean and Six Sigma, you've got the real data-driven side, and you've also got the lean side where you're talking about respect for people. Do you ever encounter, when you're talking about this topic, resistance from people who maybe are more on the data-driven side and can't quite comprehend necessarily what you're talking about with psychological safety, or do people tend to buy in right away?
I think it's hit or miss. I think one of the things recently, I was speaking at the Virginia and DC Society for Human Resource Management conference, and my topic was retention as an outcome, not a strategy. And so I think for those who are very data driven and focused, the cost of average turnover right about now, some of the numbers are saying it's around 45,000. So even if I use conservative numbers and say, okay, if average salary is $50,000, organizational turnover is 20%, which is kind of in the middle range, and we use 40% of salary, so around 20,000 per person. If you're a small company with 50 people, your turnover is about 10 people a year, and that's costing you $200,000.
Wow.
So if you're a larger company and you've got 500 people and your turnover is 20%, you're losing 100 people per year, $200 million. So when you start thinking about what is your, like they'll say like lean is soft or psychological safety is soft. Yes, but your turnover, because you don't have the right organizational culture and you're not getting to the continuous improvement mindset where you want to be, those are hard dollars. And that those dollars don't look at things like lost customers because you have turnover in poor customer experience. That doesn't get to your customers that maybe you lose because you can't deliver a product on time. That doesn't look at the burnout from your employees who are still there, who are continually and repeatedly cycling through training new employees who don't stay and continue to leave. So there's those hard numbers about like what we can look at that turnover can get attributed to, but then we also have the things where like you start to see changes in culture and morale, engagement from their continuing to be repeated and high turnover.
Talk about what a psychologically safe continuous improvement environment actually looks like in practice. How would a leader or a team member know whether they have a psychologically safe environment or not? What are the things I can look around and see in my organization and tell me that it's psychologically safe?
Yeah, I think the big teller is, how do leaders respond when things don't go well or as intended? Is there finger pointing? Is there blaming? Or is it the conversation of, you know what, I really appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Let's go back and take a look at what didn't go right. Like, let's take a look at what we need to do differently. I think it's also looking at when you are in meetings, is it one or two people who speak up, or do multiple people speak up? Like who's speaking in the room? And I think the other piece is right. Do people share what some might say, right? Is like they share news that maybe leaders don't want to hear, right? So they talk or speak about something that might be considered unpopular, but. Right. Again, psychological safety is that the feeling that they are and the experience that they can share things openly without fear of embarrassment, retribution, things like that. So those are good things in terms of being able to be like, not just what does your survey say, but what do you see and hear when you're out with individuals and going to Gemba, right? When you're out meeting with organizations. What are you seeing? What are people talking about? How do they approach and talk to one another from employees and from the leadership perspective, right? So when we think about organizations where there is psychological safety, right, they're going to look at it and think that errors or near misses, right, that's data. How do we use that data to look at maybe what do we need to adjust or do differently? They're going to see questions and they're going to equate curiosity. Right? They're going to want to be able to know more. If we can look at things differently, we can start to think about, is there a way to be more innovative or creative? When there isn't psychological safety, that's where I was saying, right? Like when errors happen, it becomes, who can we blame for this? Who's at fault? It's not so much like, who are we going to hold accountable to help them grow or help them learn and prevent this? It becomes negative and more kind of punishment related. And if questions are seen as being a weakness, people look at it and they start to not answer things maybe as openly, because for them, if there is a culture where psychological safety doesn't exist, it becomes more about risk management and compliance from the employee perspective to make sure they don't get in trouble, embarrassed, or fired. That's just a different way to see it.
MoreSteam's president, Peg Pennington, in the very first episode of the podcast, talked about an environment where it's not about naming, blaming, and shaming. And that always sticks with me. And that seems to really feed into a lot of what you're talking about as well.
Yeah. You know what? You want people to be able to feel like they can bring things to you, right? Because they're engaged enough to care. And they're saying, right, I'm seeing this and I know this isn't right. And I want us to be able to do something about it. So they are active, they participate, they're making contributions because they care, right? And so I think that's, again, one of those things when we start thinking about what does continuous improvement culture look like? What does working towards organizational excellence look like? If you don't have that element of psychological safety where people can talk and share about what's going right as well as what's maybe not going well or as intended, right? You don't know that to be able to fix it.
April, we talk about psychological safety a lot from a leadership perspective, leaders creating that environment. But what I'm kind of curious about is what about someone who is a Lean or Six Sigma practitioner, but not in a leadership role? What can they do to help build psychological safety within their own project teams, even when the broader culture might not be there quite yet?
Yeah. Right. So I think that's a great opportunity to be able to kind of lead up and just show it by example. So even if other people may not be demonstrating it yet, that's a perfect opportunity to show that it can be done. Right. As they right, taking steps forward and working towards progress and making small incremental changes is better than waiting for kind of the perfect time or opportunity, because the best time and opportunity is absolutely right now. And it's surprising, right? Like, you don't have to have a leadership role or title to be influential, and to be able to start modeling those types of behaviors and demonstrating that, because people see that. And when people see how you engage or interact, and then like they see how that person responds, and maybe somebody is observing and they're like, last time I talked to that person, right? Like, that wasn't the kind of, reaction I got. That's maybe more calm demeanor, professional, showing respect to one another. And they're like, that's how I want that person to treat me. Because what it really, I think, all comes down to is everybody is a human being and everybody is a person, and everybody wants to be treated in a way that shows dignity and respect.
April, walk me through exactly what your session at ASQ was like. When you walked into the room and you were facilitating this event, this discussion, walk me through what that was like, what the discussion was like, what people were saying. I'm so curious to hear the practitioners that you were interacting with, what they were doing during the session.
Yeah. So I because this particular topic was a networking discussion and group. It was kind of like, how do you see that happening at your organization? Or what do you feel is missing? What do you feel needs to be in place in order for there to be psychological safety? So a lot of what I saw was professionals being able to connect with others who were experiencing similar challenges, and then struggling with, how do we adjust? How do we make changes that we feel align with what's valuable to us, or what our values are, how we want to be seen as a leader? And I think what was really kind of fascinating is this was one topic that I had for the brain date. A second topic we had was on burnout, boundaries, and productivity, which then also got to this kind of double-edged sword of, when you're doing continuous improvement and you get better and you can have greater efficiency, what then becomes the expectation for what do you do with your time? And one of the things we started talking about too was, right, like the difference between, and it gets kind of back to the psychological safety piece and saying, right, are you able to take lunch? right? Are you able to show that kind of balance between, right? Like it's important you care for your health and your well-being, especially in a leadership role where you're responsible for helping grow and develop others and problem solving and that. Like, do you get to take lunch? And we talked about so many of them didn't because their lunch hour, even though time was blocked out, meetings would get scheduled over it. And that led to this other conversation of, okay, but do you feel safe saying to them, I don't attend lunch meetings because I schedule that time for myself. I need that time to be able to eat lunch, to, take that self-care time so that I get that 30 minutes so I can come back and I can be prepared and ready to address what I need to. And it was interesting that people in different stages and places in their career felt more comfortable being able to say like, yeah, no, like I'm not going to be meeting over my lunch hour on a regular and continuous basis. So but looking again, like at that psychological safety piece of, do leaders feel like they can take lunch? Can they set boundaries with their time that are respected by the organization? Do they say they value work-life balance, but then they expect you to be answering emails when you're out on vacation or on PTO? Or, being able to say, like, if you've got something happening if you have a family, right? Like I need to leave early because I've got an event to attend for one of my kids, right? Do they feel like they can do that? And is it really that there's that work-life balance? Because psychological safety would say if you don't feel that, even as a leader, like how comfortable are you addressing that and calling out this conflict between said values and lived out values and expectations?
That's really interesting, April, because one of the things I hear so often when talking to people in the continuous improvement and operational excellence space is our team has demonstrated successful completion of projects. We have shown the value in our work. And because of that, we get inundated with more work because they see the value of what we do. And we don't have enough time to do all of the work that people want us to do because we're getting from so many different sectors of the organization. We'd like you to do a project for us. We'd like you to do a project for us. And oftentimes they just don't have that time. So it seems to me that psychological safety, especially for OpEx teams, that the expectations maybe are greater than what they're actually able to accomplish just because of the virtue of how many people are on the team and how many hours are in a day. That's got to be incredibly important as they move forward.
Yeah. And that's, I think, where when we start thinking about organizational strategy and saying, like, how do you start to prioritize those projects of what aligns best with what you've set out as an organization that you need to accomplish. And then being able to look at the different projects. And I used to do that at a company that I worked at. Like, we didn't have a process for how we were going to prioritize strategic initiatives. And so I came up with a business case form that helped us to look at, like, right, who needs to be involved on the team because it impacted multiple value streams that within the organization. So who needs to be involved? Like, what areas is this going to impact? Like, how much time do you think that it's going to take? Like, how does this align with one of our top 4 strategic priorities? To start to balance and evaluate, like, what was something that was going to be high impact, but not take a lot of time, and not be maybe a significant investment, things like that, to be able to start to balance that out, because you can't take on everything, but you also have to know why would you take it on and what is the value of that and how does it impact your stakeholders, and those kinds of things. So that's where it kind of becomes the lean will say, like, if it adds value to the customer and eliminates waste, then you'll prioritize it. And then when we look at things on the Six Sigma side, it's what is the data saying? What is the return on investment going to be? And it's finding the balance between those two, which isn't always easy.
April, you made me think of something with what you just said. You're talking about different value streams throughout an organization and prioritizing projects. What if you feel a sense of psychological safety with a higher priority project, one that should be at the top, but you don't feel a sense of psychological safety from what should be a lower priority project? You are getting all sorts of criticism, what have you, from somebody whose project should be a lower priority. And so naturally, your kind of mind is, well, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Even though that's a lower priority, but you're getting different senses of psychological safety from different parts of the organization. How can you manage that as an individual where I know what the priority is, but I know where the biggest pain point is as far as somebody who might be coming after me within an organization?
Yeah, well, and I think that sometimes, right, knowing how certain individuals might respond and knowing kind of what they're passionate about, right? I think that's where knowing individuals and having relationships is extremely important, because then you can say, right, like I think of training within industry job relations. It's one of the first things we talk about, right? Is we start to look at what problems might come at you. And if you have somebody whose project that you know isn't going to be approved, but you know that it's going to be challenging, right? That's where you utilize, right, your interpersonal skills to be able to talk with them ahead of time and say, hey, you know what? I know that this is a project that's really important to you and it feels really critical. And you talk with them about it ahead of time to be able to share, right? I understand this is really important to you. And again, reaffirming kind of, is there a potential, like where does it fall in the list? When might that be able to be addressed? What would make it a stronger case for them to be able to look at it? And so I think that's where too, it's understanding, right? Is it something that is impactful, that would be something that would be considered? Is it a matter of timing? Is it that there's data missing? And being able to work with that to say, okay, is there something that we need to do differently? Or how can I help them be able to build a stronger case if this truly is something that has merit?
For someone who's been nodding along, we've been talking now for a little while. For someone who's nodding along and they're like, yeah, April, I'm totally with what you are saying. I really need to do better at this. What's one concrete thing they could do this week to move in that direction?
Start by, just checking in with your team members. And it doesn't need to be something that's long. And I know for some people, they might be listening, being like, April, I supervise like 50 people or I supervise 100 people. So if you've got a large team, then maybe it's you think about, right, who are the 5 people you want to check in with today, right? How do you start to make that a habit where you're checking in with people on a regular basis? Because, right, one of the questions I'll ask you, right, is when was the last time that you got feedback from your supervisor or manager on how you were doing? Right? When was the last time you even heard from them? Mm-hmm. And so the more that you can start to build relationships with individuals and even just saying, hey, how are you doing today? Anything that you need? Anything come up that you need to be aware of? Just like that 30-second check-in can be so powerful and so impactful when you start thinking about how do you start to build relationships? Because if people don't know you, they're not going to come to you if they've got a concern or a challenge.
April, you mentioned a little bit ago that you were recently at the SHRM Virginia and DC conference. As we record, I believe it was just last week, correct?
It was April 14th.
Retention is an outcome, not a strategy. Give us an overview of what that presentation was all about, because as you mentioned earlier, the costs of not being able to retain your employees, those are very real costs.
Yeah. So I started that one out too, with the practicing. Yeah, my background is as a social worker who fell in love with continuous improvement, but also looked at it from the perspective of Deming's quote and said, right, systems are designed to get designed exactly to get the outcomes that they do. And it said, right, so if you have a turnover and retention problem, that's a result of your system not working as you're intending it to. And so we talked about 4 different things and things that could help with turnover and retention. And the first thing was looking at what we call guilt architecture, and saying, right, so for employees, do you know what skills you need your employees to have? Do you know what skills are going to be obsolete? What do you need people to know in the next 2 to 3 years? And how are you going to help them develop those skills? Then we looked at mobility architecture within the organization. Do your people actually see a future? Do they know what job potential might be if they stay with the company? And if they can find a job easier outside of their company than inside, That's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
If people have to leave in order to grow, they're not going to stay. So I talked a little bit about, instead of looking at, kind of career ladders, like what does a career ecosystem look like instead? And thinking about different ways that people might be able to engage. The third thing we talked about was work design and saying our job structured in a way that builds capability, or is it for output only, right? Is this a dead end? Is it just focused on output? Like, how are we working to help individuals to be able to continue to grow in the work that they're doing, not block it? And then the last thing that we looked at and talked about was just their growth experience overall. Like, is it a learning organization? Is development continuous and ongoing? Or is it something that is like a training event that happens today, but then nothing ever comes from it and those skills aren't used? And so being able to think about, right, is development and growth opportunities, is that something that's seen as an extra? Or again, is it something that's a part of that learning culture, that organization where it's continuous and ongoing and there's always that opportunity? So it's like when you can align all of those things from thinking about even like the experience at the beginning of what does it look like if somebody tries to apply for a job at your company? Does it take them 45 minutes or an hour and a half? Does it take 10 to 15 minutes? How easy is it? Are you transparent about what your hiring process looks like? Are your job descriptions skill-based? And do people see what skills you're looking for? Do they see the opportunity to be able to grow with your company, that ecosystem? How are you growing your managers then to be able to support the individuals that you're bringing on, the new employees that you're bringing in? And saying, right, all of that functions as a system. It's an ecosystem. And if all of those pieces aren't aligned, that's where we start to see those challenges with turnover and retention.
April, with these presentations, you're talking to both the continuous improvement and lean world and the HR and people strategy world. Do you think those worlds are starting to find each other a little bit more? Or do you think they're still kind of siloed?
I think they're starting to find each other a little bit more. My goal is to really be able to help bridge those two together. Because HR professionals, right, they want to be business partners and they want to be able to help the rest of the organization be able to function well. I haven't met an HR person yet who feels really fabulous when they're bringing on or interviewing people and hiring them and then they don't stay. That doesn't feel great for any team member involved or for the organization. And so I think it's something where it requires everybody to come together and to be aligned and to be able to understand what the roles and what individuals are doing so that they really are functioning as not as silos, but working together throughout the organization, because it's an experience, right? So from like the website to when people come in and they join, it's all an experience, and it's the employee experience. And what do you want that to look like? What do you want that to feel like? So we talked a little bit about process mapping. We talked about journey mapping, and how those are important continuous improvement tools that can help them in HR as they're thinking about, like I said, orientation, onboarding, but just the employee experience and what might be available for them career-wise.
Thank you, April. For all of our listeners out there, I don't know what's available for you next career-wise, but I know what's available next on the show. Of course, it's this short break. MoreSteam's enterprise process improvement platform includes the tools, training, and software you need to transform your organization into a problem-solving powerhouse. Join the ranks of Fortune 500 companies that trust MoreSteam for their enterprise process improvement. Visit MoreSteam.com to learn more. Also, I want to take just a moment to thank you for listening to Quality Time with MoreSteam. You can email the show at qualitytime@moresteam.com. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. And now back to my conversation with April Thomas. You've written quite a bit about layoffs and what happens to an organization after layoffs. You've written about that. You've talked about that. When a layoff happens, the people who remain, sometimes it seems like they're walking on eggshells, right? Afraid to speak up, afraid to take risks. How does that environment undermine the continuous improvement work that's still expected to move forward?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to recognize and address the individuals who are still there, and giving an open time and opportunity for questions to be asked, and to be able to address it, because otherwise it becomes kind of that elephant in the room that everybody knows is there, but nobody really wants to talk about. And I think it's that understanding that when people are who are still there, and there can be that feeling of survivor's guilt, like, wow, I'm still here, but colleagues and friends that I've had are now let go. Individuals might feel like they have to work 2 and 3 times harder. So like staying later than normal to finish up assignments, or maybe adjusting their boundaries and being a lot more flexible because they don't want to be the next person to be let go. And so just acknowledging that, yeah, grief and loss happens and everybody experiences it differently, and it's not the same. And some people may, and some people may not. It's not the map. It's not a math equation in that way. But just that understanding that some people are going to respond and act differently. And some people, it might, like I said, there might be that time where they're like, wow, like I'm adjusting to what it's like now, when I don't have colleagues that I used to have with me. And for leaders to be able to recognize, like for certain individuals, that grief is very real, and it presents and it impacts individuals neurobiologically as well when they're experiencing grief and loss. From cognition to critical thinking and problem solving, to memory and retention of ideas, all of those things are impacted when people are experiencing grief. And so for leaders, it's recognizing and acknowledging that, and it's also holding space for that to be able to talk and understand people are not going to be right back to peak productivity. And that's really where it requires emotional intelligence from leaders to be able to connect with, and that empathy. And it goes back to when I had said, right, one of the things that leaders can do to create psychologically safe environments is to talk with their people and create that relationship. Because it ends up being kind of back to, like, how do you regain people's trust when something has happened that has impacted and potentially damaged trust? And especially if how the layoffs were done is counter to what the organizational values say they are, that can be even more impactful, and there might be more repair that needs to be done.
April, I can tell you're such an expert in this topic because you answered my next question in the answer to that last question. So very well done. You knew what I was going to say, and you went there without me even having to ask you about it. So I'm going to jump to the next question. What's one thing that leaders often do in the aftermath of a layoff that you would say, please don't do that? Do you ever see that?
I think it kind of goes back to that don't expect people to be at peak productivity right away. People will need some time, and I'm not saying it's weeks and months, but don't expect within the first 72 hours that people are going to be right back at their peak productivity. Make sure that you let them know that you're available. If you have EAP resources, let people know that if there's mental health benefits available. Because anxiety and stress, they may very well have that worry about, okay, is this just round one of layoffs? Is there going to be a second one? And might I be in there? One of the models that I liked is David Rock. He's a neuroscientist, and he's got what's called the SCARF model. So repurposing it, thinking about how does that apply with grief and loss, is for leaders to reflect on for individuals who are being laid off, is that affects the S is for status, right? If their role is changed, that can affect their identity and create feelings of change in value. And the C is for certainty, and people might feel, as I said, ambiguous about their future. The A is for autonomy. They might feel powerless, especially, again, as we talk about stress increasing, or if their workload is now increasing because colleagues aren't going to be there. The R is for relatedness. especially if people who they were close to were individuals who were laid off. Kind of that, how do they relate to individuals who are still on the team now? Because for some people, depending on how close they were, that made their teammate feel like it's part of their community, part of their social capital, their social support. And the F is for fairness. And so being able to think about, right, some of those decisions about maybe who was let go might feel unjust and it might feel unfair. And so that might also make it harder for them, individuals, to accept those changes that are taking place within a company as well. So I think one of the things for leaders that they can reflect on that and think about how those different areas are impacted and affected during the layoff and how there's a disruption, then they can be very thoughtful and intentional about what actions and steps do they need to take to rebuild with individuals.
April, this is fantastic stuff. I am so glad none of this is going to end up on the cutting room floor, because the first time I interviewed you, because of audio and technical problems, about half of that interview didn't make it into the podcast. So I'm so glad that this is being captured, because I want the whole world to hear this. This is fantastic stuff. And I want to talk a little bit more, April. You recently got a teaching job as well, correct?
So I was approved. It's one of those things in the adjunct world, right? So I'm approved to be in the pool of candidates. So if needs come up, I'm one of the people that they would like to contact to be able to teach.
To teach social work?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's one of those, it's not a guarantee that I'll have any courses, but it feels like a win when you've been accepted into the pool, like you've made it past, and they're like, we will put you in the pool of candidates that will contact if a need comes up. And that feels like a huge win in the world of academia for me.
That's a gigantic win. You hear the stories about people trying so hard to get a teaching job in college, and they go to conferences all over the country just hoping, and it's rejection after rejection. So there's got to be something about that. That's a huge win, right?
It is. And I haven't posted on it yet, but I'm in conversations with a local university to be able to join their school of business to do some adjunct teaching for them this fall. And excited because the first course is that I'll be looking to teach with them is organizational behavior. And I absolutely love that, because my social work background and what I've done in continuous improvement with organizations fits right in for that.
Well, I hope that as part of the first lesson plan, you incorporate some of the things you said in this interview, because this has been exceedingly informative and helpful.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I think there's a lot of content that's in the course that I'm really excited about.
I want to ask as well, because one thing that did make the interview last time, how are the motorcycle lessons going with your daughter?
So it's one of those things. She's just like, I had fun doing it. I'm not sure I really want to ride on a regular basis. But that's absolutely fine. You did something that you were you were interested in, you wanted to try it out, and you did it. And you're saying, okay, so I did this, but I'm not sure this is a great fit for me. And it's and so he said, that's okay. Right? It's awesome that you did it. And it's even more awesome that you feel like you can say, yeah, I did it, but I don't think I want to do it moving forward. And being able to say, yeah, that happens, right? Sometimes knowing what is a good fit for you and what isn't, I should say, right? Sometimes knowing what isn't a fit for you is almost more powerful and impactful than knowing what is. And being able to be yeah, but you did it.
Right.
You took the risk. You challenged yourself to learn something and do something you've never done before. And that's awesome.
Are you still riding, April?
I am.
How often do you get out and ride?
Well, now we're just coming into summer. So it's putting it back on the agenda to be going out at least 2 to 3 days a week to be practicing.
That is outstanding.
I offered for a conference and said, hey, if you want me to do a workshop on how strategic planning aligns with, learning to ride a motorcycle, let me know, because I'm happy to put that together.
That would be great. I know you've had a lot of things going on, April, and I know that there is a cause that you are exceedingly passionate about, that you have been very involved with, and you've made some significant progress in that area, as well as some presentations and even progress in the legal front with new important laws. Can you tell us a little bit about that, April?
Yeah. So I'm It's one of those things. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to walk with my brother as he works to establish Kaytlyn Madison Thomas Memorial Foundation as a formal nonprofit. For those listening, my niece Kaytlyn was killed by a drunk and impaired driver going the wrong way down the interstate with a blood alcohol level more than 3 times the legal limit on July 12th, 2021. And since then, working, as I said, with my brother to be able to help get a foundation started. So we use a lot of continuous improvement concepts too, as we start to put that together. That's a whole nother conversation. But in Wisconsin, my brother and his family were able to meet with legislators back in January about an ignition interlock device bill that was signed into law in April this year by Governor Tony Evers. I've had the privilege of being able to talk with legislators and be able to do a public service announcement with MAD last year and to be able to speak at some of their events and spoke at their candlelight vigil in honor of those who had lost a loved one to drunken or impaired driving. That was this Tuesday on the 21st. And so I've had some opportunities to be able to speak in the community to help others understand that driving impaired and driving drunk is a choice, and it's a choice that has some pretty devastating consequences, especially for those of us as family members who are left behind. We end up with a lifetime membership to a club that we never wanted to join and have unfortunately joined it because somebody we love paid the ultimate sacrifice, and they're no longer with us. And so being able to help promote awareness and education to help prevent drunk driving, because we know that impacts a little over 11,000 people are killed every year. I would say those are probably statistics on the low end, but that doesn't include the impact of it on individuals and families and community members. And so our goal is, everybody deserves to get home safely, because it only takes meeting a drunk driver once.
April, you're doing absolutely tremendous work in that area. And I would love to have you on again in the future to talk about the continuous improvement you are doing, because you said that's a whole nother conversation. It's a conversation that I think would be incredibly valuable to share with our audience. And in the last episode that you were on, I had some information about your cause and foundation in the show notes, and I will include that once again in the show notes for this episode as well. Thank you for all the hard work that you're doing. I know it's not work you ever wanted to do or ever wanted to be called to do, but the fact that you're doing it and bringing all of your expertise and knowledge is making a real impact and difference for people's lives every day.
Thank you. And I'll also share with you, we have our very first ever on recognizing a 5-year anniversary since Kaytlyn was killed. We have our first ever memorial walk coming up on July 12th. So I'll send that to you in case anybody wants to register.
Absolutely. And if you send that link to me, I will include that in the show notes as well. April, this has been a tremendous conversation. Thank you so very much. Your area of expertise is absolutely so fascinating to me. And I just love hearing about the people skills and the soft skills that come along with Lean Six Sigma and continuous improvement. Because again, just like you said, if that culture that enables it is not there, all of the data, none of that even matters, because it's not going to happen.
Or it might not even be the real data.
Right.
So, yeah. So, right. People a lot of times will say, like, the interpersonal skills, they're soft skills, they're not hard skills. Well, they are hard skills. They're hard skills to develop in their behaviors, but those are the skills that get you those hard dollars when you start talking about ROI and productivity and competitive advantage. So it's like we say that they're soft, but really that's what leads to organizations really being able to be successful.
I think that is a perfect way to close this episode. April Thomas, thank you so much for joining us once again. And like I said, sometime in 2027, we would love to have you back on the show again.
That sounds great. And I'll look forward to seeing you sometime over the summer.
Absolutely. At the MoreSteam Best Practices for Operational Excellence Conference, where we first met when we were introduced by the process whisperer himself, world traveler, Lean Six Sigma Hall of Famer, Dave Harry.
Yes. And I've already got my tickets and it's on my calendar.
Excellent. We will see you then, April. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great morning.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Quality Time with MoreSteam. Thanks again.